Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. Returning to the show for it's more than quarterly at this point. I don't know how else you would break up a year. It's not monthly, bi monthly. I don't know. It doesn't matter.
Something like
The
that.
the long awaited return of Snyder Minutes, Screen Rants, whatever you might be doing in the meantime. Stephen Colbert is here to talk about Rebel Moon in general, but more specifically, the premiere that Stephen was at for Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire. Stephen, thank you for coming back to the show.
Hey, I already chimed in a second ago and interrupted your intro, but hey again.
Oh, am I getting a phone call? Nope, it's my watch telling me to go to bed. That's not happening today. Well, I mean at some point. Everybody get your sleep. It's important. So yes, Zack Snyder's newest franchise has been added to Netflix. Well, when you're listening to this, it will be available on Netflix, but as of recording, Steven was fortunate enough to be at the LA premiere, and then I was fortunate enough to attend a limited Toronto screening. So it is the first post BVS film for me seeing in theaters, and I'm sure that's going to be discussed. As with a regular film review, there will be a non spoiler section and then there will be a spoiler section. Time codes for each of those segments will be listed in the description. I don't want to waste any more of your time because I figure this will likely be the longest episode of the podcast ever. I say that every time, and usually it's right. So, without further ado, let's hear that sound clip.
What do you think they want?
Everything.
I hope Stephen heard that.
I did.
And so, obviously, I'm just going to get it out of the way because I know Steven doesn't want to hear it. But for a lot of general film audiences, Rebel Moon is as if Zack Snyder made his own Star Wars. I'm not going to say it anymore. But one of the things, and this is an element that I think is going to be more interesting to discuss in the non-spoiler section, is there are so many archetypes in fiction that get popularized in specific iterations of that. And if you are a long fan of Star Wars, and famously, here's a little behind the scenes on Kyle growing up. I don't think I've told this story that after the special editions were released on DVD, so this would have been the early 2000s. Again, I haven't watched the special editions since this era, but there was a phenomenal documentary included in that box set called Empire of Dreams, which if you do have Disney Plus, it's available there. And it is probably the reason I fell in love with behind the scenes featurettes in general. And it really dives into George Lucas's studies of the classics, and I am by no means an expert on that. It's one of the elements I love about what you and Dice do with Snyder Minute content, specifically, obviously BVS being the stuff you guys have addressed the most. But that framework and those archetypes have been, as Joseph Campbell has established, pretty much the bread and butter of every major successful fantasy storyline, whether that or regardless, genre narrative in general. And so Zack Snyder's spin on those classic archetypes is 1,000% present here. But even as somebody who thoroughly enjoys Star Wars, that seems demeaning to what is presented in this film. And so I wanted to get it out of the way. I know there are going to be a lot of people comparing that to this, but in general, there are a lot of things you can pull from every different influence. And I meant to rewatch Excalibur before I saw Rebel Moon, and I didn't do it. So I'm a little disappointed in myself. But that stuff is present in this. But again, what I like so much about what Zach brings to those archetypes and those characters is they feel so wholeheartedly different from versions that have been popularized before.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because on one hand, you can't not make the Star Wars comparison with this movie, and famously, I think, and there's a lot of conflicting information about this, about whether or not it was originated as a rejected Star Wars pitch or not. I will say the version of that story that I pushed, based on what he said on set and the way he's mentioned it elsewhere, is that this story is far older than when he made it as a Star Wars pitch. He's been working on it for far longer than that. At one point, he almost reverse engineered it into the Star Wars universe when he talked to Lucasfilm. Um, but you see a lot of people kind of backhandedly say like, "Oh, it's literally a rejected Star Wars pitch." It's like, well, no, it's an original property that at one point almost became Star Wars and then didn't, which is drastically different than, Zack Snyder's canceled Star Wars movie. But um, yeah, it's really fascinating because functionally he's doing exactly what Lucas did with the first with Star Wars, but Lucas was kind of inspired by a different generation of sci-fi and fantasy mythology, where Star Wars takes it's got Kurosawa is a major influence on that, obviously, but then you've got like the Flash Gordon, and sort of that era of sci-fi is very present throughout Star Wars, whereas for Snyder there's a lot more, like, you shift up a couple decades with the influences. You've got Conan the Barbarian, you've got Excalibur, you've got, Star Wars a little bit in there, but like really, other than some sort of structurally speaking, I've been comparing it to, like, it's more like if like Frank Frazetta and Frank Herbert had a baby. Is kind of what you get in this than you do with the Lucas stuff. And so like Zack Snyder's Star Wars is a really good shorthand, but in my opinion, this is wildly different and more than just that. It's kind of I think a reductive. It's going to be what people call it forever, and it's going to be irritating. But like there's a lot of different kind of stuff going on with this, with where he's actually pulling from.
And yeah, it's I think what so I don't I'm trying there's one key aspect of the film, and I guess I can kind of talk about that now because it's not necessarily a spoiler, but one of the elements that, yeah, I guess, yeah, we can talk about this in generalities, because the last thing I would want to do is spoil this. Again, talking about this before anybody has really seen it. This has only happened a couple times, at least for this show, and so I'm trying to be even more careful. But what I like so much about what Zach does aesthetically is really push things to the nth degree, whether that's in the tactile nature of the spaceships, which are significantly more submarine in aesthetic. And I know you mentioned this with the Soviet Union and the USSR elements really being there with the what are they called?
The Imperium.
The Imperium, yes. And even in the color schemes in general, and I would argue a lot of the mannerisms, particularly of the higher up members of the militia. And an element that frustrated me, and I find the irony of this, is that, as I mentioned, the last Zack Snyder film that I saw in theaters was BVS theatrical edition, because unfortunately, I mean, I'm not going to give a film history on Justice League, but if you know, you know. And then Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League was never had a screening up here, and then Army of the Dead did not, and so it's been a while. And I should say, one of the conversations I don't want to have, because it's going to be completely reductive on what I do want to talk about is, and I know you reposted this tweet because it feels like we're back in 2016 again with everyone's favorite Rotten Vegetable score. But talking about what something is good or bad, and while I'm going to be completely upfront, this isn't one of my favorites of his films. What frustrated me more so was what was presented. I thoroughly enjoyed, but it felt very similar to BVS, where and even more so because BVS, we eventually learned it was a 3-hour movie, and you got the Ultimate Edition. That was, I wouldn't classify wasn't retroactive. It was after. And so, but in the lead up to this, we know there is an extended cut of, I would assume at this, I'm making a general assumption. We know there's an extended cut of A Child of Fire. I would be shocked if there's not one of Scargiver
Yeah,
based
for
on,
both there is.
for both. Exactly. And the conversation that I had with my friend after seeing this was, I was invested, but with, I'm just going to make an assumption. Let's say it's half an hour cut. I think that would have
About an
dramatically
hour.
okay, so there you go. And so there, the all the characters, I liked the archetypes of how they play, and they are consistently being presented in familiar ways. But again, it's with Zach's spin on all of the crew, and that, I mean, it's Seven Samurai, Magnificent Seven presentation, and even to some degree the environment, particularly on Korra's world. It's very, I mean, we have wheat, space wheat to some degree, and I like that, particularly with the environment design with the giant planet essentially looking like it's about to engulf where they are located. But with some of the supporting characters, I went, oh my god, we've got like, this is why you got Jaimon Hansu, and you tell me he's tragic, but I mean, I know things because of like elements of your set visit that you mentioned on Screen Rant, and you're in your conversation with Dice, but in having that stuff cut out, to me, and even more so, I would like, this is, I don't think Child of Fire suffers from part 1 syndrome. It's been interesting that this year in general has had a number of big budget stories being presented in this fashion, but I would say, even though that this is listed in that way, that the main purpose of this film is concluded, and it just happens to immediately kick off to some degree with Scargiver, that I don't understand why Netflix, I understand streaming metrics and those work in very different ways, like, oh, we got to keep people watching us, but it's a streamer. Why did you automatically give a cut down version? And the element for me that was the most frustrating was in the action. Like, it felt subdued from where's, like, even the people who are most critical of Zach praise his use of action.
Yeah,
And
this one is a little bit weird, and I know that they're gonna be getting an entire podcast on this, so I can try to keep it pretty brief. But I think that the Zack Snyder narrative, particularly because of the Snyder cut, really makes it difficult for people to evaluate like what this is actually doing. And there's a variety of things going on with the way they're releasing the cuts for this, which um I understand, and I don't know, I'll try to be non-judgmental of the why and the how, but I will say functionally this is different from anything he's done before. Like Zach has always, um, despite this like no compromise kind of thing that he pushed for with Netflix, and then after the Snyder cut, he's always worked with the studio to kind of lean into, like back with like Dawn of the Dead, that wasn't like a director's cut situation, right? That was an R-rated movie, and they kind of let him go pretty far. Those director's cuts, like back in the day that he cut his teeth on initially, were like DVD bonus, like those were how to boost home media sales, right? That like in the 2000s, those unrated cuts, all sorts of stuff was getting these unrated cuts, and that's what Dawn of the Dead was. Um, and there's even some scenes like in the unrated cut where if you listen to the oh, where was there's somewhere that he said, I think he did commentary with Eric Newman of the deleted scenes, and there's deleted scenes where he's like, oh yeah, this, we didn't like this because of whatever, and that's why I didn't get it in the cut. And you watch the unrated cut, and like it's in there, and it's like a TV cut where they add extra stuff in for TV to fit with commercial breaks and stuff. And so that's not to say like, I think the unrated cut is the kind of preferred version of Dawn of the Dead, but the point is that he's always worked with them to give this like give his version of the movie, but also to capitalize on the needs of the market, right? To give bonus features, to give extra add-on sales. BVS is even similar. Yeah, the studio wanted that stuff taken out of there, But then, but also he was like, well, I always do a director's cut of some kind, so we'll do that. Or Watchmen is a great example where the theatrical cut was determined by IMAX limitations. The theatrical cut was cut down because it literally couldn't be longer and stay on the film palette. Um, and then in addition to that, there was then the director's cut that was the longer version released at home. And then on top of that, he did the ultimate cut, which isn't even his preferred cut. It's just a different experience because it includes the Black Freighter stuff. And so that is really the context people need to be looking at this one in. Is it's not a like studio demands situation. It's literally him working with Netflix to say, okay, look, we did one shoot, we shot for 6 months or however long it was, and I got you 2 movies out of one budget. And now we're going to get 2 releases out of each of those. So functionally, Netflix is going to be releasing 4 movies. And now there's a lot of, you could be as cynical as you want about it because of the nature of streaming services. It's the best way to think about this is more along the lines of like a DLC model, basically. And this is, I liked the movie and I think that the cut works. It is a PG-13 version of this story. It's not a cut down version of the R-rated version. The R-rated hour, 3+ hour version. I've seen clips from it. It's like 300 violence. And so if you've seen this cut, you're like, well, how does that happen? That's not just like adding a shot in here and there. That's like fundamentally different, adding in blood splatters and stuff like that. And so it's not simply, oh, they took out some scenes. It's actually they engineered one version of the movie for a PG-13 experience. They engineered a different version of the experience for this, like the Watchmen Black Freighter kind of version, where it's like, oh, this one is just all the bells and whistles from the beginning. And so I understand why they would do that from like a marketing perspective. In a way, maybe Netflix is even trying to like organically recreate that Snyder Cut situation, which is, I don't know, considering the nature of the Snyder Cut and why it happened, there's a little bit of it tastes a little bit weird, but but Zach cooperated with this because, going back to Dawn of the Dead days, he's like, oh, here, let's give you an alternate cut to release on home media. And it's kind of got that flavor to me. And so, but it's the fact of the matter is it's impossible to get away from the fact that this is 66% of half of a story. Right. And that's not me criticizing it for being that. I'm just saying that is what it is, right? They split the movie into 2 parts, and then they removed 30% or 33%, 33 and a third percent or whatever, however long of what was supposed to, not what was supposed to be, but what is in compared to the longer version. And so that, the biggest complaint that I have about this is I want more. Right now, the nice thing is I've got another cut of this coming, and I've got part 2 coming. So everything that I want from this, I'm gonna get, and I don't need to fight for it and hashtag campaign and all that.
You don't want to buy shirts?
So that's cool. If I consider this like a it's almost like a teaser, right? Like Netflix is just kind of priming it's like, oh, here's this version of it, and then you're gonna get the longer version. And so that's why I say it's like Netflix is doing like almost like a DLC model. Or I even compared it to like anyone from like the PlayStation days remembers the demo discs they used to give out.
I was just gonna say that it's a demo.
Yeah, and it's rough because like there's a lot of people who like you would say that, and like the idea of a streamer releasing a demo disc version of a movie is like heinous, right? In an era where they're canceling Batgirl and all that kind of stuff, like I don't know, how are you supposed to feel about this? But the fact of the matter is, you go back to, like I said, this is the equivalent of let's see what we can do to capitalize on the home media market and release an alternate cut of the movie there. Like that's Zach is working with the medium in that way. And I know for a fact I'm going to like the longer version better. There's going to be more there for the characters. The tonally, the action doubtless is going to be superior. And I knew that from the beginning, right? I wasn't like, oh, I wonder which cut I'll like better. So, and I think they know that too. But the difference is that if you consider this like, whetting people's appetite for what's to come, it's a little bit less cynical than like the Warner Brothers days where it's like, oh, there was a big fight and they only released this version. So I don't know. Like I said, I could go on and on and on. I've already gave a lot of kind of rambling about the nature of that, but it's such a different situation that I think exists solely because, like, if this was a streaming movie or not a stream, if this was a theatrical movie, like release the R-rated version like day what like on IMAX, and like that's just like your only foot forward. But on a streaming service where you're like, oh, we can release 10 versions of the movie to Netflix if they wanted to, right? Um, it's and I would not be surprised if this is successful. You know, we're going to see 4 releases. Like they're going to roll out those extended cuts as like they're not just going to appear on the service one day, right? They're probably going to have cast interviews and promotions and all sorts. So Netflix is getting 4 releases out of this. If it is successful, I wouldn't be shocked if you start seeing a lot more of that from other streamers and other filmmakers too, which I don't know how I feel about it, but like I said, we're getting the better cut. It's not like, it's not like nobody's getting screwed here. The
Yeah.
consumers are just kind of inconvenienced by the version of the movie that releases first, and that is what it is.
Yeah, I think that the your contextualization for that I think certainly will be helpful, but just being somebody who I'd say in general enjoys when Zach has those longer versions, that not being my first introduction to this new world of his was just frustrating because knowing there's more and enjoying those longer versions, I was like, oh, you're right. Like it whet my appetite for this, and I loved all the introduction. Like if this was the demo, like yeah, I'm buying the battle pass or the DLC included to continue to explore this.
Yeah. Or like I asked people after we saw it at the premiere, that one of the first things I said to the people I saw it with was, if you had the option and you had to choose between, you walk right back into the theater and they put on another movie, and it could be either the 3-hour R-rated version of this movie, or you get to see the theatrical edit of part 2. Um, and then which one would you choose? And I was like, I would go back and watch the 3-hour version of this one and wait until April to see part 2. Like that's how, like, it was good enough for me to be like, I want that. Like, and that's the thing, is it's not like I watch this and think like, oh, this is, it's like I watch it, and my biggest frustration is like, it gets to the end of this movie, and the second it like the score changes and the cinematography changes, and you're like, oh, there's this pang of like, oh man, I want more. I
So
needed this to
your
keep on
answer
going.
was you want the extended version immediately as opposed to part 2?
Yeah, yeah. If I could choose, either watch the short version of part 2 right now, or watch the extended version of this movie and then wait for part 2, I would watch I would have gone back and watched the exact same movie but the extended version right away if I had that option.
I don't know.
Although I do want to know part 2, but like I enjoyed this enough that like that's what I want like the most right now, is to see the longer version of this one. Well, and I'd be willing to wait for part 2 if I could see that, right away instead.
Yeah, well, so because I'm of two minds for that because I I'm sold on Rebel Moon and no not knowing because I didn't, but I guess well I'm trying to think. Do we have? I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say before. You know what? So I think we've talked in generalities enough. I don't want to say anything that might skew as a spoiler. So that I think we've given a general positive opinion on the film. So if you're looking forward to watching this on streaming, if you still have Netflix, when it's $47 a month or whatever it is now, um, recommend checking it out. I'm gonna answer that question in spoilers, and let's play sound clip 2.
I have found her. The most wanted fugitive in the known universe.
All right, so I'm of two minds because I think the conclusion to the story is much more satisfying when you have the fuller version of part 1,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, so I'm going to flip your question and throw it back at you because I actually don't think I know the answer to this. And this is not a comparison. I don't want anybody from either fandom or whatever coming
Too
at
late.
me. It was all right. It's over. That we were presented all 3 Lord of the Ringses theatrically And then, to my knowledge, we then got all the extendeds. And I've never gone through the extendeds. I've only ever seen the theatricals. I own the extendeds, but they're very long. And I just haven't had a chance to go through them yet. Is that I liked this enough to where I would like to see the ending, and then preferably then I get to explore the whole thing as two extendeds later. So I'm of two. I don't know.
Well,
If I
because
had
remember
to,
also, and even the way Zach describes it is the longer versions of these it's not just a longer version. Like to even to compare it to it, like the best comparison would be to say if let's say Zach stayed on Justice League production all the way until the end, and the theatrical version of Justice League that we got from Joss Whedon, we got something like that, but overseen by Zach the entire time. And then we also got the Snyder cut as it exists, right? That is closer to a comparison to what this is actually going to be than
yeah,
than it would be to say something like BVS or like the Watchmen Ultimate Cut. But even that, both are R rated, right?
mhm.
So even that's not like there are things they did where like in BVS, for example, it's R rated because like a guy gets punched into a wall and there's a blood smear. Whereas like that's we're talking about like the style of action is different. There's
Mhm.
300 style blood splatters and hatchets going into people's faces and
Well, yeah,
like
lots of knife wounds that were very quickly cut off camera.
yeah, yeah, exploding heads, decapitations, like
Oh, can
and
we talk about that really quickly? The
mhm.
tactile nature of this sci-fi. So I don't know if you remember this show, but one of the elements to this, and I don't think it actually had anything to do with the design for this, but I kept thinking of the television show Cyber Six a lot. I don't know why. It was a
I've
very
never
weird
heard of that.
show. Yeah, I don't know if it was exclusively Canadian, but it was like a robot woman pretending to be a man, but then was also like a vigilante at night. It was this weird neo noir thing, and I don't know why I kept thinking of that the whole time. I also had a lot of like what if Cowboy Bebop but good vibes from the actual space travel nature, which was refreshing to begin with because the Cowboy Bebop ironic Netflix adaptation was terrible in my opinion. I mean
Mhm.
most people's opinion. One thing I wanted to shout out, and so I don't know actually know this too. This is just gonna be me learning things today, but there is follow me with the ADHD connection is the expansive uniqueness of all of the cast, particularly with I want to make sure I'm pronouncing this correctly. Stas Nair
Mhm.
as Tarak. He reminded me so much of Charles Vane from Black Sails
Oh,
that it was
Dice is gonna be
drive
happy to hear that.
I know. It was driving me crazy. And because I was looking at it, I'm like, that I know it's not him. I watched Supergirl. That's not Zach McCowan. But the aesthetic of long, I think Charles Vane has braids and um Tarek does not. He's just got long, like craggly hair. But just the like abs on abs, just glistening in the sun. I mean, I think his skin is darker than Zach McCowan's was more like golden Michael Bay tan. But the character who I was pleasantly surprised. We're in full spoilers, so all the details are going to come out. One element that I'm so happy was particularly was the characterizations of this. Again, there are so many classical archetypes that Zach uses, and the way that he plays with them, I really enjoyed in particular. And watching the trailer that was for both movies, I went, "Oh no. Like this is a I can't remember there's a famous expression within the honest trailer world where it's like, "Okay, movie, you're the movie." And I just kept thinking that while watching the extended trailer of both parts, like what's happening, I can't focus. There's too much. But
Mhm.
specifically with Charlie Hunnam's Kai, where I'm fairly certain, and you can correct me because they were your words, about him being like the Han Solo type.
Yeah.
And while I think it is quite obvious what that twist is going to be. I'm really happy it was the case, and that you get to see there's so many actors in this in general that I've really enjoyed in other things. And Charlie Hunnam has been somebody who quite famously has been in a lot of things. Obviously Sons of Anarchy being probably the most famous, but he was in The Gentleman quite recently, which is one of my favorite movies of that year. And so really getting him to play up that like obviously suave nature, but obvious this guy is a piece of work. Elements
well,
too had
and also Zach is always very self-aware of the tropes too, and so so like with this character, he's playing it's the mercenary with a heart of gold, but not right. And that's kind of where he twists the knife on that, is like, oh, everybody knows that, Han Solo. It's exactly Han Solo if he actually didn't show up again at the end of A New Hope, right?
Yeah, or he
Like,
sold them to Jabba.
yeah,
If they never took off Tatooine. And one element I was really nervous about because there was a lot happening, as I've said, in the trailers for this, so not necessarily knowing where it was going and not, I think, fully comprehending the possibility of all the different timelines of what was going on.
Mhm.
And my biggest concern was they kept talking about this princess, and I was just hoping that it wasn't going to be Korra, because
Yeah.
that is the chosen child hidden from the world element
Mhm.
that King Arthur, Star Wars,
Yeah.
it's in everything. And I'm really, what's funny to me is, I promised I wasn't going to do this, but I'm gonna, is what they've done with Korra, and it's not listed on here what her actual name is.
Oh, yeah. I meant to write that down after, but
Because
yeah,
it's very long.
Mhm.
Is it listed on the IMDb? Nope, still not. Okay, she is the new regent's adopted daughter. Arianis? No, that's wrong. It's something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. Anyways, but the element of her being brought into the, I can't. The one thing is, having only seen this one time, all of the different words for. I mean, Star Wars has been around for 45 years, so
Yeah.
forgive
the
me
Imperium.
for the Imperium, but also ironically, the Imperium are in the first ever episode of the Justice League cartoon. That's what invades Earth in 2001. But the idea of her being an orphan as a result of an Imperium invasion, and then being brought in by Belisarius. Hey, I got that one. I didn't have to look. Oh, I was right.
Belisarius.
Oh, sorry.
So close.
And then becoming this superior officer and being in charge of the young girl, Carrie
Princess
Elway's
Issa.
daughter. Yeah. And that ultimately, like, she breaks free of that, is an element that they introduced in the sequels and then didn't really bother to like maintain that. And so I love the idea of this actually coming from a true rebellion of somebody breaking free from what they were raised in.
Mhm. Well,
Which,
and it's that way a little bit for all of them too, because we talked about all the inspiration from like the Conan the Barbarian and Dune and Frank Frazetta and heavy metal and Excalibur, and like you've got all that, but then also like whereas like Star Wars was inspired by, there's some Roman in there, and there's a lot of Vietnam in there, and other stuff. This takes like from so many different kind of colonialist cultures, where because you've got it with Korra, you've also got it with Titus, where it's these people who were taken from their home but then become a part of, or Kai also, right? Like all of these people are impacted by this militarized force that comes in, destroys their home world, and then either like Kai, they just become like a nihilist, or like Korra and Titus for a while ended up becoming tools of the Empire or the Imperium, until they kind of turn against it. But that's such a they talk like Jaimin Hansu, when he read the script, he said something like, "It's like, that's what happened to my people." It's like that's actually the story of like where I'm from.
Mhm.
So it's a cool thing to be present, not just with a few kind of token characters, but as a element of world building, you do feel that at play kind of across the board.
Yeah, and again, one thing that it's continually been a conversation topic amongst just I'd say the Hollywood machine in general about representation, and Zach's been somebody who continuously has kind of added that throughout his filmography. And in general, one of the elements that I really did like was the vastness of the different cultures, particularly in the film in general. And I know you with your set visit talked about all the how the individual actors and they were able to bring some of their background, and but that like with I not to make it or just be dismissive of that, it's one of my favorite elements of, I almost just said Arthur, um Aquaman with
Mhm. Mhm.
Jason Momoa, right? And using some of that like his Hawaiian heritage into the tale of Aquaman, and
Yeah,
then even
or
having
Wonder Woman too. They brought like how they used Gal Gadot's accent for the Amazons.
yeah, exactly. And what I would love to just have him explain all the fun tech, because this does have swords that are very hot. Um and like I think they do a really interesting job of establishing how these things work, and the tactile nature, at least for me in a big sci-fi movie like this, really does make a difference.
Yeah.
Where I ironically, if you're listening to this day of release, I recently saw Wonka, and I was very grateful that it had such a significant amount of practical sets, regardless of it being big and expansive. Like when you feel grounded even in something that might be super unrealistic, but I feel as if at least the ground the characters are walking on and the lived in nature of the costumes, even more so with the characters like the militia within the Imperium, and everybody's things all feeling hodgepodge.
Well,
And
it's
I
like when you
know,
watch. That's one of my biggest gripes with the all of the Disney Plus Star Wars shows is like everyone walks out and it's like you feel like you can see like creases in their shirts still from where they took it off the cardboard form. Like there's a weird level of like, wow, everyone's clothes are like like it's so antithetical to what Star Wars always was, where like you see everyone's got like sweat stains on their shirts and stuff. And then
mhm,
you watch the Disney Plus stuff and they're all like, I don't know, not that's not even. But that's the difference with Andor though. Andor goes back to that where you're not watching and you're like that stormtrooper's armor is like way too clean for a desert planet. Like whereas this, I saw someone made a comment that I really appreciated was like what everyone smells like.
oh yeah,
like
that's a great, absolutely,
like you
yeah.
watch this and you're like you can taste the air, and like these environments are all very, everyone is grimy and sweaty and like it jumps off the screen in more ways than just visually. Like there's a tactile vibe to what's going on.
Well, and it's another Lucasfilm thing. One of my favorite elements of the behind the scenes for the first Raiders is the costume designer, and they bought the fedora, and the costume designer was sitting with Harrison Ford, and she's like, I'm rolling up and I'm sitting on it, and then Harrison Ford is like stepping on it and you making something feel lived in. And when you are meant to buy in that even with the Imperium being the governing body of this galaxy or universe, that things are not as good as they used to be. One big
Mhm.
criticism, this movie doesn't have enough Carrie Elways. I love the fact that he's in this and just show like he's in Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, and then he's in this as well. I'm like, give me
I
more Carrie Elways.
I forgot that he was in this, and we were sitting at the premiere, and he came walking, like we were sitting right near where everyone got out of their car to like go in to like get the press photos and stuff, and most of the people kind of would just go in, and like maybe they'd wave at us or something, but then he came in and like clearly a pro, clearly been doing this for a while, comes in, looks over, walks past the whole row of the section I was sitting in, waves to everybody. Got like a up close picture of him that was like, I don't know, it's such a weird moment of like not really typically like starstruck and I wasn't even starstruck with him, so it was just weird for as a kid that grew up on Princess Bride. I haven't had a situation yet where I've met someone where it's like, oh wow, like I watched you like all the time.
And now you're standing in front of me
like,
as
and now
an
you're
an actualized human being.
yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that that's the case because the coming from like a Robert Redford film to this, not Robert Redford, Robert Reiner. It's so funny. I love that movie so much. I'm trying to think of other things. I'm just gonna be completely honest. I'm super mad that Ray Fisher dies.
Yeah, that was if you listen to, I think we maybe mentioned the trailer breakdown. Dice and I were like, "Oh, maybe they're setting him up." It seems like he's not in this very much. I wouldn't be shocked if they're setting him up for a spin-off or something. No, we were definitely accurate in the fact that he didn't have many scenes. Totally for different reasons than I expected, though. I'm really curious to know what else he's got in the extended cut because that was very, very little screen time.
Yeah, and I like how in as opposed to something feeling like completely fully fledged, it's interesting to me given how, I mean, typically in general when you have an empirical force to some degree, I mean, the Nazis are the most famous villains in human history. And so that like their aesthetic is obviously been canonized significantly, whether that's in Star Wars, Indiana, as actual villains in Indiana Jones and whatnot, and then using the Soviet design more so in this. That I found it really interesting that as opposed to having a group of complete individuals, which is typical for a storytelling mechanics in that nature, with when you have a rebellion, that there is uniformity.
Uniformity.
Uniformity. Thank you. It's been a long day. Amongst the actual Blood Axe rebellion, like everyone has that face paint design, which I was not expecting, and I'm sure it's presented in the trailers, but having that feel more of the moment, particularly with Darian Blood Axe being like, well, no, one of our choices is the result of them needing us. And then him having an awesome death scene.
Mm-hmm.
But again, going back to your question in the non-spoilers, I think I kind of want to see part 2 more so, just to see the conclusions for this. And I'm particularly with the lead up to the significance of Korra, where she's the most wanted being in the universe, and that, again, expecting something and then not getting it and being very happy when we had I loved the fight scene so much between again, names are gonna escape me. What was Ed Screen's name? Noble. I should remember that one. Atticus Noble and his fight scene with Korra on that hover rig.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I got so many vibes from the Mask of Zorro.
Oh yeah.
In that fight scene. Which is amazing. If you're gonna be inspired by stuff, that, in my opinion, is one of the best action adventure movies. Period. So
it doesn't get enough credit for.
No, it doesn't. It's
like
I'm gonna plug something else. I'm going to be covering that movie on Movies to Watch Before You Die. So look for that in the near future because it's one of my favorite movies of all time. But in having the villain die again, with this being brand new and original, and seeing enough movies, obviously there are much more smart. I mean, that's the reason I have Steven on the show. He's smarter than I. But having these conventional expectations and knowing what the influences for this was going to be. First of all, I was surprised he died or was critically injured. And as he was in the process of being rejuvenated or revived, I just sat there thinking to myself, partially because he's also in Big
Deadpool.
Eyes. No, not Deadpool. The one with the big eye girl.
Alita.
Alita, that's the one where he's like 99% robot. I don't want to be thinking about Star Wars when I'm watching these, and the last thing I want is Ed Screen to be put in a robot.
Hmm.
I like, just please don't do it. Please don't do it. And then the way that this is some elements I love just in general in film where they show you something and I was not think when he's doing his like chest drugs and then he's clearly loves his tentacle monster and this is a family friendly podcast. So
Makes me very nervous about what we're gonna get in
yeah.
the R-rated version.
So let's move on from that, kids. Don't ask your parents about that. But in how that connects to and this is again going into I kind of want to see part 2 more and answering this is where is Belisarius when he gets brought into this electrical womb thing?
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm moving around because I'm not gonna clip that part, but like the unanswered and unique elements in kind of solving these problems made me very curious. And it's something you brought up on your Snyder minute coverage, which was like he's clearly wearing old age makeup, and we get some elements of flashback, but again, there's a lot of other things we haven't seen yet that I'm hoping we get more so in Scargiver. And one of the elements I like so much, and this is the irony, just talking about other franchises where there was such secrecy behind what Endgame was going to be called
Hmm.
when it was no longer going to be part 2. And I don't know what that was. I'm in an attic. I hear everything. And so, but having Scargiver being said out loud and not really knowing what that could mean excited me more so for what the answers are going to be in part 2.
Yeah, I think that was a big question that Dice and I were trying to figure out that I'm still not sure of. Is it's possible they got Frafi or Fa. I don't know which name has the R in it. Is it Fa or Fra?
Frothy.
Frafi. I don't know if they like the fact that they aged Fra up so significantly with prosthetics makes me wonder, like, okay, does that mean we get a lot of backstory, or does that mean like what just happened to Noble maybe happens to Belisarius and he gets rejuvenated and he like I don't, but I have a hard time believing they hired Fra with the intention of the majority of his screen time being as an aged up version of himself. That's just a weird. It feels like they're you to me. Zach would only do a move like this if he's planning on doing some sort of pulling a trick with playing with the age in a way. Otherwise, he would have just hired somebody that was the age that he wanted. So I'm very curious about that. Although there was also reference of like Belisarius possibly getting his own spin-off series. Like if there's a spin-off like live action show, I think that the discussion is that's who it would be about. So maybe that's a factor. I don't know. It's a really fascinating question though about like why they went that route. There is a reason. I don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And I found it interesting that it's funny. You get elements of this, like when we're told stuff and explained. I liked getting to see familiar faces. Jenna Malone, particularly as a giant Spider Woman.
Mm-hmm.
That was a phenomenal introduction for Nemesis. And I
It's
kind
such
of
a much more nuanced and emotional scene than I was expecting too. I was expecting that to be just like kind of the spider is bad, here's a fight. But there's a lot more going on with that scene that I was really invested in.
well, and I mean, the whole conversation comes down to perspective, right? And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I found it. Is ironic the word I wanted? It's not a metaphor. It doesn't matter. But the connective nature to the conversation about justice and vengeance, and then obviously some of the reactions to everybody's favorite mouse who flies' use of vengeance in Batman v Superman, which was always going to be on my mind. But particularly with Nemesis in general, I like that the character just saying very little, but then every time that she speaks, like the weight behind the choice in words I found that so significant. Right?
Yeah.
Like you have other people involved, particularly like Gunner from the farm, who I loved in Orphan Black. And so getting him to play very much off type in this, I really enjoyed. And him, like, I, the ridiculous nature of her, and it's an element of an element of world building I always really enjoy, which is when they go to meet her, we're seeing her in the middle of her story, like she's doing something already. It's
Yeah,
just
and it's unrelated to what
yeah.
they're doing. And well, even that opening shot where like, and I'm sure I highly suspect like the R-rated version will have a longer lead up to that. But the way they're just like, and they're all on the elevator together was very like where she was prior to that moment isn't relevant to this story, right? It's like, oh, we're just dropping you into a side quest.
Mhm.
It was really interesting.
Yeah, and the recruitment obviously is going to be something that I think is everybody's going to be familiar with, but getting to see what they call them, realms, in this instead of planets.
I'm not sure. I thought I think a lot of them were moons.
Okay.
But I don't know. Yeah, I don't remember if they named them. If they called them something else.
Yeah, I'm really glad that the movie didn't land on a sand planet and then stay there for the rest of the movie, because
Mhm.
that would have been a nightmare. The thing that I'm most curious about, and I want to know more of particularly, and there's elements of this that are in the trailers that I know you, and then this is the benefit of me listening to you guys discuss it particularly, was the Turok having some noble elements,
Yeah.
and how's that going to play out, particularly with, we know that the Imperium, well, they kill the coolest original alien I've seen in a very long time with
Yeah.
Leviticus. That was amazing.
Well, and the part of the effects were phenomenal and the design was really cool. The way like a tear started running down the tentacle or drool or whatever that was, I was like, oh wow, that's I don't know. It was emoting in ways that are not typical of like humanoids,
Hmm.
but that were still translated well. It's like I knew what was going on.
Hmm.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by not just the character design, but like the lore, like the biological lore of like what is this character even doing?
Yeah, and I would be remiss without, I thought of this as it was happening, and I just found it funny. I'm really glad that Turok had his taming of the hippogriff from Prisoner of
Mhm.
Azkaban. Um, but that relationship, I think, is really interesting, particularly because in this world in general, it seems pretty anthropomorphic. And then, as we were talking about before the podcast started, where I got a poster from the TIFF screening, which has Cora riding a griffin with a flaming sword, which not in the movie whatsoever, but it's an element that I really do appreciate, and connecting it to something I'm going to be talking on the podcast in a week or so, is that the Christmas special of Doctor Who is going to have goblins in it, which are obviously much more a fantasy based creature, but having just a straight up griffin in this, and how those elements are going to work, particularly like in typical fashion with a ruling class, if this is the Imperium. And we know Belisarius has been reacting much more with the hammer as opposed to the carrot in terms of dealing with the remnants of the universe or galaxy. Is, while we know obviously he's looking for Korra because it's his adopted daughter, but I'm curious if to to connect it to another franchise with like Aragon being the king, that is that element of Turok being a former nobleman going to come up?
Yeah, well, we saw um the trailer that combined the two, that very first trailer that had stuff from part two in it. Also, there was that shot of him with a white griffin in the background. I didn't even recognize him there because he didn't have the hair and he was wearing like a tuxedo or whatever that was. And so I see that and I'm like, okay, is that backstory for that's got to be a flashback scene? And so is that backstory that we're going to get in the extended cut, or is that something from part two? And I don't know, but yeah, there's obviously a lot going on there, and even the way he, that obviously includes, um, the way that like he tells the I think it's called a Bennu, or the Griffin, where he's like, we're the same, and he even knew from the beginning, like, can you tame that? And he's like, oh yeah, like he knew, he had a level of familiarity already.
Yeah, sorry. I was looking at the trailer. Yeah, and he's got, well, so it looks like it's a white griffin, and he's got feathers on him. And so this is the version of, or this is the hairstyle for Stas Nair that I'm used to, having watched all of Supergirl, which he was in. So I had completely forgotten he was in this. And so, yeah, the funeral of somebody related to him, and was that Imperium related, which would, again, it would give him a motivation to why he wants to kill the Imperium or destroy the Imperium, regardless of who they are in general. But yeah, it's a lot of stuff. And what I find most interesting about the film in general is, I'm trying to think. This would have been a different podcast, but because that episode, I think, it doesn't matter. But Army of the Dead, just comparatively, I found to be slightly more succinct in the introduction to the world. And I guess you have the benefit of that being more earthbound. I mean, it is earthbound outside of the potential for where the not zombies, or aliens came from. And so I'm very curious to see how this story shapes up, given how we have, as you mentioned, like, we're going to get 2 theatrical cuts. That's just what I'm going to call them. And then we are going to get 2 extended cuts. Now, I'm very curious as to what the extended cuts are going to be called, because obviously, you and I both know they're not just going to be called extended cuts. I would love it if I could pay money where it's just called Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, A Child of Fire.
Yeah. Or it'd be fascinating if they reveal it as like the Snyder cut of, like, if they just own that, like, right, like, imagine. No, I mean, Netflix would be smart to own the Snyder cut brand, basically, right? I mean, Zach would be smart to not give that up, but for them to monetize the idea of a Snyder, not just a Zack Snyder director's cut, but there's Rebel Moon and there's the Snyder cut of Rebel Moon, would be I wouldn't be shocked if they went that route. But I think he's been referring to them as a director's cut, is what he calls it. So it's possible it'll just be, and of course, this is not that this even necessarily means anything, but I think I saw a screenshot from like Letterboxd or something where someone typed in Rebel Moon and it popped up Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, and Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire director's cut.
Oh, interesting. I don't know. I'm trying to see if there was a
I think those
quote.
are all user submitted too, though, I think. So who even knows?
I don't know. I'm looking here at the Collider article, looking for where it actually came up. There's also going to be an extended R-rated version of both films. So mixing 4 different features. Okay. Doesn't say. But that's neither here nor there. So yeah, I think it's safe to say, if you are a fan of Zack's films, particularly his more recent ones with the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League, Army of the Dead, I liked getting to see not Xander Cage. What's his name? Xander Cage? From Army of Thieves. What was that guy's name? Oh no, I lost it. He was in Army of Thieves. What was his name?
Oh yeah.
Brad Cage.
Yeah.
So yeah, Stuart Martin being the like conventional, very popular farmer was very interesting. Obviously, a number of constant Zack Snyder contributors from the acting pool were in this. It was cool to see Darkseid as just an absolute piece of garbage, slave owner, and I guess they owed him money. I don't know. It was an interesting dynamic that he had with Tarak. Yeah, do you have anything else, Steven, that you wanted to discuss, or?
I don't know. I mean, there's the nature of the movie, I think, is fascinating, because like I said, the biggest thing about it is that um I feel like almost every corner of it um has you asking what else is there.
Mhm.
It's a very like the universe is designed and the story is designed in such a way that like almost everything that happens you're like, oh, I want to know more about that. Um and so there's like a lot of speculation that can be done about that, but also I think it's exciting to see like what that means for the extended cut. Um, and I know that even the extended cut, there's going to be a lot of stuff too that like just because you say, "Oh, I feel like there's more there," doesn't mean we're going to get like it's the universe is so expansive that even the 3 hour cut may leave us being like, "Oh wow, there's still more details around like the resolution with which this universe is kind of plotted out." Um, leaves like a lot to explore there, and then we're gonna get that with animated series and games and comic books and all sorts of stuff. So I'm really really curious in that. I think that the thing that I'm saying, which is the sort of the best way to sum it up, but sounds probably a lot of people take it as a negative, is I keep on going back to the fact that functionally it can't escape the fact that it's 2/3 of half a movie, um, in many ways, and I think if this were like a theatrical release and it was a theatrical universe being launched, that would be something that would be a problem. But as the first component of a planned release that includes a longer version of this, I watch this and I say, "Oh, awesome! I can't wait for the longer version," as opposed to, "Why the hell did they cut all that stuff out?" Um, and so yeah, like I said, I'm very excited to find out what happens in part two, but I think currently I'm even more excited to know like, oh, if this is the short version, what's in the long version?
Yeah, I would sit with that sentiment as well. All right. That will do it for the spoiler discussion of Rebel Moon, A Child of Fire. Yes. The theatrical cut. Next week's episode of the podcast will be a review of Aquaman, The Lost Kingdom, as well as, Jermaine, this is for you, my complete DCEU tier list. So you can look forward to that on that episode. That episode will come out on Christmas Day. I have to have it pre-recorded to that, so I am doubting I will have a guest for that one. But that will do it for that episode, and then there may be some leading up to the end of the year, but I haven't really figured that out yet. This being a one-man show, typically that's kind of how it rolls. If you would like to interact with the show and are listening on Spotify, there is a question embedded in every episode that I will ask and react to. More frequently, they've been about Doctor Who, but that's because we did 3 weeks of Doctor Who. So, as this is also being pre-recorded, I asked Stephen, I will ask you the question because this was included in the Wonka review. What is your favorite kind of chocolate? Is it dark, milk, or white?
Dark.
Yeah, me too. So you can answer that question on Spotify. As always, please leave a positive review or a constructive one on your podcast platform. Any star ranking is appreciated as it helps the podcast move into the algorithm. We are getting to the end of the year, and as I've mentioned before, the podcast saw substantial growth on Spotify specifically this year. Apple Podcast gives horrible statistics, so I don't really know if anything happened, but I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't enjoy it, and I appreciate that the listeners and the guests who come onto the show are also enjoying it. So without not saying it again, Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show and your consistent, I was going to say addition. That's probably the best way to do it, but maintaining the communication specifically on Snyder related films and DC related films. My top episode still currently, I don't know why I closed the link, I don't think I've told you this yet, is still, and I'm not surprised by this, it is my number one rated episode is called The DCEU is Dead with Stephen Colbert. So that came out a year ago today, day of recording. So look at
Wow.
where we are now.
It's like
So-
one of my favorite recurring tweets is the DCEU is over again.
Yeah, that was I thoroughly enjoyed. I think I sent it to you where I put James Gunn's face over the Grant Gustin meme when officially we learned that none of the Justice League were going to be coming back. So that will do it for this episode of the podcast. I'm Colin Aranya. This is Stephen Colbert of Snyder Minute, of Screen Rant. All the stuff is there. It's a Stephen Colbert, but to me, he's the Stephen Colbert. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one.